Chapter 49, the biosphere. So we talked about how the planet is tilted on its axis, and we believe that this is most likely due to a planetesimal colliding with the Earth. That planetesimal's name is Theia, and we'll talk about how she did collide with the Earth and how it formed our moon in a later lecture. And then today we talked about how that axis tilts gives us our seasons, because the sunlight is going to be hitting directly at different portions of the Earth. In the summertime, we know that we're going to be more towards the Tropic of Cancer, and over here we'll be more towards the Tropic of Capricorn, versus here and here we're pretty even, and the intensity is the highest over the equator, and this relates to seasons. So because the Earth is round and we have uneven heating because of the axis tilt, we also are going to have uneven heating because we have areas of water and land. This gives us our different air currents. So today we talked a little bit about these air currents and the different names for them. The direction in which the wind is coming out of reflects the naming system here. So for instance, our prevailing southwesterlies, they're going to be blowing, the wind's coming out of the south and blowing in a westerly direction, versus here our trade winds. The trade winds are named after, because those are major passageways that ships would take to trade goods. So we have the northeast trade winds, which are coming out of the north and blowing to the east. Then we also have our other ones, because remember, it's all kind of reflective around that equator. We have the southeast trade winds are coming out of the south and going to the east. So the shape of the land, or topography, also has to do with climate in that area. We had mentioned a little bit today about how water will hold on to heat longer than land, and so we get this uneven heating here, which leads us to getting constant breezes. Like we could get an inland breeze, or it's going to go out to sea, depending whether it's day or nighttime, because of those temperature changes. We also, as we pick up that moist water from the ocean, it will then heat up in this area here, and we will end up with evaporation, which is going to cause condensation in our little clouds here. And our clouds have to be able to get up over this mountain range right here. So in order to do that, they're going to have to rain. So we get this nice green area on you could say the west side of the mountain range. But on the east side here, we get what's called a rain shadow. Now, a rain shadow is, again, because those clouds have spent all their moisture, it's now going to be very dry. And this is where we're going to see some deserts forming here in this area. Water versus land. So because of specific heat of water, bodies of water do not gain or lose temperature as rapidly as land. And we talked about this a couple times now. And we also talked about how the temperature differences between the water and the land could create winds, which may affect the weather. Think about that. Next time you open your oven, notice how you'll have a gush of hot air coming out of the oven as soon as you open it. As a matter of fact, and I've done this several times, you go to quickly look inside your oven, and of course that hot air burns your face. So you kind of open it, let the hot air escape, and then you look in to see if what you're cooking is ready. And again, you have to think about, there's a big temperature difference inside the oven and out, and that's what's creating that wind. There's not a fan or something inside that oven that's blowing the air out when you open the oven door. So a good example of how temperature difference can create winds. So let's look at the terrestrial ecosystems. So we've got the tundra, we have the taiga, which is also called the northern coniferous forest, the temperate deciduous forest, grasslands, tropical rainforests, and deserts. Right, the tundra. The tundra is found in the northern part of the continents in the northern hemisphere. Not content, continents. Now, they typically have short summers. The Only the upper part of the soil unfreezes during the summer, and the rest is permanently frozen. And it's referred to as permafrost. The soil in this area, in this particular biome, is nutrient poor. We'll find short grasses, sages, and lichens and moss. Now the taiga, which is located, you can see here in the northern hemisphere, in the northern part of the continents. Also, it's just not as high up in the latitude, in the northern latitudes. Now, the taiga is also referred to, like I said earlier, is now called the northern coniferous forest. So the tundra would be north of it. There is no southern relative due to lack of landmass at these latitudes. Coniferous forests. So many of us are familiar with coniferous forests. Those are, of course, mostly the evergreens, forest of evergreens, and we see them up in northern Wisconsin. So there are three main locations. So again, another name for them would be like our taiga, and we have them on the mountaintops and Pacific coast. So these are trees which reproduce using cones, which are largely represented by the spruce, fir, and pine, and as I said earlier, the evergreens. The next biome we have is the temperate deciduous forest. Now, these are forests that are made up mainly of trees that lose their leaves to prepare for winter. And we've talked about earlier as to why trees lose their leaves. And again, it's something that we're very familiar with here in northern Illinois. So here are some locations of the temperate deciduous forest, and of course we are right in through here. So up in northern Illinois, we also see here in Europe, over here in, we could say China, and some down here in Australia. Some characteristics of temperate deciduous forests. They are mainly made up of trees, shrubs, and low-lying plants. Many different animals, mostly what we have locally. So we're talking bears, coyotes, deer, raccoons, possums. The more north you go, it slowly changes to our coniferous forests. So as you know, once you get past northern Wisconsin and get up into the northern part of Canada, it's going to switch over to the coniferous forest, and then we get into our tundra. Tropical forests, they have large amounts of rain, warm temperatures, they have very complex ecosystems. We find the greatest amount of biodiversity here in a tropical rainforest. They are generally located near the equator. So this slide kind of shows you where you'll find some of those tropical forests. So one of the biggest problems we have today is destruction of the tropical rainforest. The problem is the soil nutrition is low in the rainforest, and the warm temperatures and high moisture allows the nutrients to be quickly broken down and recycled into biomass. This creates a problem for agriculture. So people need food, so they slash and burn. So they cut down the forest, burn it, and they might get a few years of crops out of that soil. But with all the rain, a lot of the nutrients and the soil itself get washed away. And again, it's poor nutrients to begin with. So you'll only get a few years of crops out of that small amount of area that you cut down. So again, then you need to cut more down to make more space, and it's just a vicious cycle in which they're tearing down these rainforests, and it's not really giving them the crop production that they need to sustain that particular population of people. So when you look at the destruction rate, about 2.4 acres are being slashed and burned per second. So that calculates up to about 78 million acres a year. So it's estimated that 137 species are driven to extinction per day. Now the next biome are the shrublands, and they contain mostly shrubs and grasses. They do require a burn cycle to maintain, kind of like the prairies. Seed regeneration, certain plants again need to be burned in order for the seeds to germinate. It also kills back any encroaching trees. Some of the common animals we see in the shrublands are the mule deer, rodents, lizards, and birds. So here's a map showing you where the shrubland locations can be found. So we see some in Africa, South America, a little bit in North America, over here in Europe, in the Middle East, and Australia. Now, shrublands are also referred to as what we call a chaparral. And so we did have quite a few of these areas where I grew up in San Diego. So we did have chaparrals out there. Now, the grasslands is an area where there is not enough water to support trees, but too much water for it to be considered a desert. So it contains mostly grasses. So here are some locations of grasslands. We commonly refer to them as a prairie ecosystem out here in northern Illinois. So there are two types of grasslands. There's temperate grasslands. That they have very cold winters and very hot summers. So that, again, that's what we're familiar with out here. So we see it in Russia, the U.S., South Africa, and Australia. Now, savannas are different. It does not have this large temperature extremes. So we see this in Central Africa and South America. This is why we do not have lions in our grasslands, because our grasslands, are too cold. So we'll see lions down here in the savannas. Now, deserts, they have winds that lack moisture. So their annual rainfall is less than 25 centimeters. It generally comes all in one season. So that's usually in the late winter, early spring out in the deserts in California. Very hot in the daytime, and when that sunlight goes down, it gets very cold. So you will need, most people in California have winter coats for the desert. If you're native to the Illinois, a heavy sweatshirt would probably be fine. But it does get pretty chilly at night. Plants out there include shrubs, grasses, and some succulents, which we call cacti. And what else do I want to say? Most of the cacti are what we call angiosperms. They do flower, so that is one of the best times to go out in the desert is in the spring to watch the cactus flower. And this is a picture of the Southwest, probably Arizona or New Mexico, and you can see the cacti and the mountains. Of course, this would be the side that gets that rain shadow, so it would be on the east side of the mountains. So in this slide, you can see the different locations for the deserts that we find across our planet. So let's move on to aquatic ecosystems. So there are three basic types of aquatic ecosystem. We've got freshwater, saltwater, and then brackish. Brackish is kind of like an in-between. It's generally where freshwater river merges with the ocean. So the water is not as high in salt as saltwater, but it is much higher than freshwater. It's like an in-between location. You could refer to it as an ecotone. Then we have the wetlands, and these are areas that are wet for part of the year. We've got marshes, swamps, bogs. We do have some of these up here in northern Illinois also. So let's talk about marshes. So marshes are generally underwater for most of the time, and in them we'll see reeds and grasses. Now, swamps are areas of standing water. Primarily, we'll see woody plants, shrubs, and trees. And in the southern part of the U.S., alligators. Now what we see with bogs is generally the water is acidic, and that affects the soil. So the soil ends up consisting of what we call peat deposits and sphagnum mosses. So very poor nutrient soil. This is where we're going to see some plants that have adapted to this. Since they cannot get the nitrogen from the soil, they eat insects, and these are our carnivorous plants. Cranberries and orchids also do quite well in those type of environments. So if you go out to Glacier Park, you'll actually see the sphagnum mosses. There is a cove of cranberry bushes out there as well. And if you go to Volo Bogs, there's supposed to be, and I have not had time to get out there, there's supposed to be quite a few different types of carnivorous plants out at Volo Bog. And here's just a picture of what that bog would look like, and you can see some of this is a peat moss, and over here this is a pitcher plant, one of the many types of carnivorous plants. Lakes. So lakes are freshwater bodies of water. The types of lakes characterized by the nutrient availability. We have oligotrophic, which is a poor, nutrient poor environment. Eutrophic, which is nutrient rich, and we have a process which is called eutrophication. And the words are not really centered very well. There you go. So with eutrophication, this is a process which puts nutrients into a lake. It's generally with runoff with fertilizers. This is a problem we have here, and we can see it right here in McHenry County, in that we have a lot of farming going on in this community, and they put fertilizers, and when we have rain, that runoff carries the fertilizers, they go into the streams and then the lakes, and so we're fertilizing all the plants that are inside those lakes, and they just love it. So it's kind of like Miracle-Gro in lakes. So the algae starts to grow out of control, the lily pads start to grow out of control, and we see that on Lily Lake. And what will eventually happen is it will totally mess up the balance of that lake, and eventually the fish will start to die off, and we'll kind of start to fill in those lakes. Because many of those lakes, the problem is also that not only are they getting nutrients put into the lake, but also soil and other deposits. So it's filling in and making the lakes very shallow. So eventually those lakes will turn into basically a swamp. So with these large bodies of waters, lakes, and we even see this a little bit in some ways in oceans, but let's focus on lakes here. When it's summertime and you have that air, that heated air up here coming in contact with the water, it's going to warm up the upper layers, and we're going to actually start to separate the layers, and as we go down, it's going to get colder. So we call it stratification based on temperature and density. Now in the fall, the wind is going to start to occur, and it's also not going to be as warm, and so it's going to kind of stir up the lake. So we're going to get this even temperature throughout the lake. This helps to bring the nutrients to the top of the lake, so it's kind of what we call a fall overturn. And this is a great time to go fishing. A lot of people will take off during this time in the fall to go fishing. Now in the winter, we're going to end up getting that stratification again, because the top part is going to freeze, and that kind of insulates the liquid water underneath the sheet of ice. And so this all, again, becomes kind of separated with this barrier. So we kind of get this separation of temperature. And then in the spring, the ice melts, and then the wind again and the external temperatures can affect the water, and we're going to get this spring turnover. So again, another time that's great to fish. So these two times is really important. These two times, these overturns, allow the nutrients that would have otherwise been stuck on the bottom of the lake to get mixed up and recycled in these ecosystems. Now there's a lot of vocab here when we talk about lakes and oceans. Now the pelagic zone is basically the water that is from the top all the way down. Okay, So the pelagic zone can be divided into two, and one's the the photic zone. That's the area that the sunlight will penetrate, and then the aphotic zone, which the light does not go down that deep. So again, the pelagic or pelagic is basically the water depth. Okay, so we have an area that does get sunlight and an area that does not get sunlight. So here we've got our with sun, without sun. Then we also can talk about the bottom here, this whole bottom. So which is called the benthic zone, and the benthic zone is again the whole bottom of that, whether it is the ocean, basin, or lake. And we have this abyssal zone, which is kind of like out in the middle of nowhere. And then we have the intertidal. The intertidal zone is mostly for like oceans. This is where we have tides that are going to go up and down. The intertidal zones are the area that's underwater at high tide and exposed during low tide. And then we have our continental shelf. Now that's kind of like where the continent ends, and you got this really big steep drop off a large slope here. And then when we also talk about here, we've got the oceanic zone, which is from basically that shelf out to open water, and the neritic zone, which goes from that shelf all the way up to the shoreline. So there's different words here to define. The benthos talks about mostly everything that's at the bottom, all the living stuff, and the bottom of the ocean. There's not a whole lot living out here in this abyssal zone. And then, like I said, the intertidal is a bunch of other types of organisms that live sometimes underwater and sometimes above. So lots of different things here in terminology on how it's divided by, again, sunlight, and then kind of like with the nutrients, what's available. And that does end the PowerPoint presentation for chapter 49.